You ever notice how the products we trust the most are the ones we question the least? I was scrolling through a baby registry the other day. One of those long lists full of gadgets and bottles and pastel colored stuff, and I started wondering, how did we even get here? How did we get from rocking chairs and lullabies to Bluetooth monitors and designer diapers? That question took me down a rabbit hole I wasn't expecting, and what I found was darker than I ever imagined. This isn't just a story about baby products. It's a story about trust, about how fear becomes a business model, about how generations of parents, good people, were sold comfort, but paid in consequences. Today we're looking back at the forgotten, the overlooked, and the deliberately buried stories in the world of parenting, from Victorian syrups laced with morphine to diapers accused of chemical burns in the age of social media. And if you think this is just history, think again. Because these stories, these echoes, they're still shaping the way we live, buy, and care for the most vulnerable among us. And maybe they're shaping how we ignore our own instincts too. Welcome to True Crime Echoes. This is the dark history of baby products and what it says about all of us. Chapter 1. Everyone's having babies. And it got me thinking. I don't know about you, but lately it feels like everyone I know is having a baby. Cousins, coworkers, old high school friends I haven't spoken to in years. Suddenly it's all baby showers, gender reveals, and group texts filled with tiny socks and pastel onesies. And honestly, I'm happy for them. I really am. But here's the thing, it's got me looking at baby registry after baby registry. And let me tell you, baby stuff today, it's on another level. There are wipe warmers, bottle sterilizing pods, high-tech bassinets that rock your baby to sleep with AI or something. And don't even get me started on the toy subscriptions for infants. Like your baby gets monthly developmental toys curated by child psychologists, I barely get my own laundry done. And I get it when it comes to babies, parents want the best, the safest, the softest, the cleanest. If a product promises comfort, health, or even 10 minutes of uninterrupted sleep, it's going on that registry. And in a way that makes sense. Babies are vulnerable and parents are exhausted. That combination creates a market hungry for anything that sounds even remotely helpful. But all this scrolling and clicking and shopping made me pause. Because even though we're surrounded by all this sleek modern baby gear now, I started wondering, has it always been like this? Have we always been so obsessed with optimizing the baby experience? So I started looking into it, and what I found, it was way darker than I expected. Turns out the baby product industry didn't just appear out of nowhere, and it wasn't always about making things better for babies. In fact, some of the earliest baby products weren't just unhelpful, they were dangerous, like deadly dangerous. There were syrups sold to soothe teething pain that contained actual opiates, pacifiers soaked in alcohol. There were cages, literal cages parents would hang outside their apartment windows with their babies inside them. All of it was marketed as helpful, soothing, modern. But the reality, it left a trail of harm behind. And it made me think, just because something is labeled as being for the baby doesn't mean it's safe, or even that it was made with the baby's best interest in mind. So today we're diving into the dark history of toxic baby products. We're talking about the good intentions, the horrible outcomes, and the long, slow road to regulation and safety. We'll look at the products parents trusted and how some of those choices ended in tragedy. And maybe we'll understand how history got us here and whether we're still repeating some of those same mistakes, just with better packaging. Whether you're a parent or not, I think it's worth asking, who are baby products really made for the babies or the people trying to sell them? Let's talk about it. Chapter 2. Whiskey Rags and Sugar Tits, the Wild Origins of Soothing Babies. So here's the thing. No one really tells you when you're scrolling through pastel-colored pacifiers and BPA-free bottles on Amazon. None of this is new. Our obsession with soothing babies, especially when they're teething, goes way back. Like way back. Long before doctors with medical degrees and parenting books with sleep training strategies, people had to just figure things out. There were no guidelines, no internet forums, no pediatricians a phone call away. Parents, mostly mothers, did whatever seemed to work, even if it was a little weird, or a lot dangerous. Take pacifiers, for example. Today, they're made of medical-grade silicone, come in cute shapes, and are marketed with words like orthodontic safe and clinically tested. But the earliest versions of pacifiers were nothing like that. And honestly, they weren't even called pacifiers. They were called, wait for it, sugar tits. I swear I'm not making that up. That was the actual name, sugar tits. It sounds funny now, kind of wild and maybe even a little inappropriate, but back then it was just what you did. A sugar tit was a piece of cloth, usually linen or muslin, wrapped around a chunk of bread soaked in honey. Sometimes it was soaked in a little milk, sometimes molasses, but often it was dipped in alcohol. Straight up whiskey. And that makes sense in a horrifying kind of way, because it wasn't just about feeding the baby, it was about knocking them out, calming their cries, helping them sleep. And you know what? It worked. The babies would stop crying, they'd go quiet. And the parents, exhausted, overwhelmed with no modern medicine in sight, finally got some rest. It's easy to judge now from the comfort of our air-conditioned nurseries and sterilized teething rings. But you have to remember this was survival parenting. These people were doing their best with what they had. And what they had was honey bread cloth and whiskey. Now here's where things get darker. Because soothing babies became such a challenge, people started experimenting. And not all of those experiments were as innocent as dipping a rag in liquor. In the 1800s, especially during the Victorian era, infant mortality was shockingly high. People were dying from all kinds of infections and diseases, and children were the most vulnerable. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and science, at least as we understand it today, was still very much in its infancy. So when a baby started teething and crying, screaming, really, parents would panic. Doctors would panic. And that led to some deeply disturbing practices that were considered medical at the time. One of the most horrifying methods was called gum lancing. Yeah, just what it sounds like. When a baby was teething, doctors believed the pain came from pressure under the gums. So their solution, take a scalpel or whatever sharp blade was available and cut open the baby's gum to release the pressure. No anesthesia, no numbing, just slice. And this wasn't fringe medicine either, it was standard practice. There are actual medical journals from that era describing this in detail. They thought it helped, they genuinely believed they were doing good. But can you imagine the trauma, the pain, the risk of infection? Even worse, there was no real understanding of dosage or safety when it came to pain relief. Alcohol was often used, even encouraged. You'd give a baby a little rum, a little brandy to calm them down after slicing their mouth open. And if that didn't work, well, there were other cures waiting in the wings, most of them homemade, unregulated, and sold by word of mouth. This wasn't just a problem in rural towns or poor communities either. Even in cities among educated families, these methods were common, because there simply weren't alternatives. And that's what makes this part of history so chilling to me. It's not that parents didn't care. It's not that doctors were evil. It's that nobody knew any better. And in the absence of real science, people will cling to anything that seems to work, even if the thing that works is slowly poisoning their child. I kept coming back to this question while I was researching. What does it mean to soothe a baby? Is it about calming them or calming us? Because when you're up at 3 a.m. with a screaming infant, your brain is screaming too. You do almost anything for silence. And I think that desire, the desperate need for peace, is what the entire baby product industry has been built around, then and now. Back then, it was alcohol-drenched cloths and surgical blades. Today, it's $2,000 self-rocking bassinets and Bluetooth-connected white noise machines. Same goal, different tools. But what scares me is how easily we still trust the tools without really questioning what's in them. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that just because something calms a baby doesn't mean it's safe for a baby. We're going to see this again and again as we dig deeper into this story. From sweet syrups laced with morphine to high-tech diapers that caused chemical burns, the history of baby products is full of good intentions gone terribly wrong. And it all started with a simple piece of cloth, some honey, and a desperate hope that just maybe this time the baby would sleep. Chapter 3. The Sweet Syrup That Silenced Babies. Forever. When I first came across the name Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, I thought it sounded kind of old-timey and sweet, like something you'd find in a vintage apothecary bottle on someone's cottagecore bookshelf. Maybe it smells like lavender or is made with herbs from the garden. You know, harmless, soothing. But the deeper I looked, the more that name started to feel chilling. And the word soothing, that one started sounding more like a warning. Let me take you back to the mid-1800s. We're still in the era of bloodletting mercury tonics and whiskey pacifiers. It's the Victorian period. Science was more guesswork than knowledge, and babies were still being treated like tiny adults. No one really understood how their bodies worked. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that teething was awful. For the baby, sure, but also for the parents. That's where a woman named Charlotte N. Winslow comes in. She was a midwife from Maine, and like many midwives at the time, she was trusted more than most doctors. She'd seen more births, soothed, more crying babies, and probably had more hands-on experience than the men in white coats. One day, she decided she was done watching babies suffer through teething, and maybe even more tired of hearing them scream. So she made a syrup, a little concoction she whipped up at home with ingredients she believed would soothe the pain. And to be fair, it worked. The babies calmed down. They slept, for hours, sometimes even days. She gave it to the infants she cared for. She gave it to her own daughter, and people started to notice this stuff was like a miracle. The crying stopped. The chaos quieted. But what most people didn't know was what was actually inside that syrup. Charlotte never patented it. She never sold it widely, but her daughter grew up, married a pharmacist named Jeremiah Curtis. And that's when everything changed. Jeremiah saw dollar signs. He took his mother-in-law's homemade syrup and turned it into a commercial product. He slapped a label on it, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and started selling it in his pharmacy. He tweaked the formula just a bit, probably to make it more effective. Or maybe just more addictive. The magic ingredient, morphine. Yeah, morphine. An opioid. A literal narcotic. In a baby product. Back then, morphine was kind of a wonder drug. People didn't know how dangerous it was. It was prescribed for everything. Headaches, toothaches, anxiety, diarrhea. If you had a problem, morphine was the solution. It was everywhere. So adding it to a syrup for teething babies didn't feel wrong. In fact, it felt advanced. And the thing is, again, it worked. Just half a teaspoon and a baby would sleep like the dead. Parents were relieved. For the first time in what felt like weeks, they could rest too. Sales skyrocketed. By the late 1800s, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was being sold in millions of bottles every year. Not just in the US, but all over the world. You'd walk into any drugstore and find a smiling ad of a mother holding her child next to a glowing testimonial about how peaceful their home had become since using the syrup. But here's the dark part. Morphine isn't just addictive, it's deadly. Especially in babies. At the time, there were no regulations, no required labels listing ingredients, no dosage standards. Most parents didn't even know they were giving their infants opioids, and the recommended doses printed on the bottles, they were wild. Infants under 1 month old were told to take 6 to 10 drops. 3-month-olds, half a teaspoon. 6-month-olds, up to 4 teaspoons a day. Let that sink in. We now know that even a few drops of morphine can suppress an infant's respiratory system. Their breathing slows, their heart rate drops, and eventually they just stop. At first, parents and doctors blamed the deaths on common illnesses of the time: dysentery, cholera, pneumonia. But as the deaths kept piling up, people started to notice a pattern. The common denominator wasn't a disease, it was the syrup. Babies were dying quietly in their cribs. Some would go to sleep and never wake up. And those that survived, many were suffering from full-blown opioid addiction. They'd scream and shake when the syrup wore off. They'd cry uncontrollably until someone gave them another spoonful. The parents had no idea their children were going through withdrawal. And still, the bottles kept selling. There were pharmacists who raised concerns, doctors who begged for regulation, journalists who wrote exposés. One headline read, "The slaughter of the innocents continues." Another simply called it the baby killer medicine. But none of it stopped the syrup from flying off the shelves. Why? Because it worked. Because it made life easier. And because when you're exhausted and scared and just trying to make it through the night, you trust the product that promises peace. It wasn't until 1906, over 50 years after the syrup started selling, that Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, the first real attempt to regulate medicines and require ingredient labels. But even then, the syrup didn't disappear. It stuck around until the 1930s, and no one knows exactly how many babies died during those years. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe more. It's hard to face the fact that something so gentle-sounding, so maternal. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was one of the most lethal baby products ever sold. But that's the thing about history. The scariest stories aren't always the ones with monsters or killers. Sometimes they're the ones with smiling faces and sweet labels, the ones that were supposed to help. And I can't stop thinking about this, how many parents blamed themselves for those deaths. How many mothers carried that guilt, never realizing it wasn't their fault. It was the syrup. And the people who made it knew exactly what they were doing. Chapter 4. The Baby Cages, Hanging Outside Apartment Windows. I don't know about you, but when I first heard the term baby cage, I thought it was a joke. Like one of those bizarre parenting hacks someone made up for internet shock value. But no, baby cages were real. And not only were they real, they were once recommended by doctors, endorsed by first ladies, and loved by urban parents across the country. I'll be honest, the first time I saw a photo of one, I gasped. It was literally a metal cage like the kind you'd keep a pet in, but it was attached to the outside of an apartment window, and inside a baby, sometimes bundled up in a little blanket, sometimes just lying there kicking their feet in the open air. So how did we get here? Why were people hanging their infants outside of buildings like flower boxes? Well, to understand the logic behind this, we have to go back to the 1920s. Cities like New York and London were overcrowded, noisy, and full of smoke, soot, and disease. Most working-class families lived in small, stuffy apartments with barely any access to fresh air or green space. It wasn't uncommon for a whole family to share a one-bedroom flat. And during this time, one disease was dominating the headlines: tuberculosis, or TB. It was known as the White Plague, and it was terrifying. It could spread just from a cough or a sneeze. It attacked the lungs. It was relentless and often deadly, especially in crowded urban areas. Doctors at the time didn't have antibiotics. There was no cure, no vaccine. So the best advice they could give was fresh air. Seriously, open the windows, get outside, breathe deeply, let the sunlight hit your skin. Nature, they believed, was the closest thing to medicine, and in fairness, that wasn't entirely wrong. Fresh air did help. Outdoor sanitariums were common, where TB patients were wheeled out to sunbathe on porches bundled in blankets. Children were taught in open-air classrooms, even in the dead of winter. There are photos of kids sitting at their desks in coats and mittens, their noses red from the cold, but the windows were wide open. So if fresh air was good for sick adults, the thinking went, then surely it must be good for babies too. The problem: babies couldn't exactly go for a walk. Most urban apartments didn't have yards or balconies, so parents, especially mothers, stuck at home with fussy infants and no childcare, got creative. And that's where the baby cage comes in. In 1922, a woman named Emma Red patented a wire mesh cage that could be mounted outside a window. It had a little cover for shade, a slanted roof to keep the rain off, and enough space for a baby to lie down or sit up. It was like a mini porch swing, except your baby was suspended several stories above the sidewalk. To us today, it sounds terrifying, but at the time it was seen as innovative, progressive even. Some parents felt empowered. They could give their babies the healing power of outdoor air without leaving their apartments. Doctors approved. And when Eleanor Roosevelt, yes, the Eleanor Roosevelt reportedly used one for her own child while living in a New York City walk-up, the idea went mainstream. Newspapers ran full-page ads encouraging families to buy baby cages. They were marketed as solutions for health, not just convenience. Let your child breathe in the fresh morning air one would read without leaving your kitchen. Part of me gets it. These parents were doing what they thought was right. They weren't trying to endanger their kids. They were listening to doctors, trusting the science available at the time. And again, it's not like we've never done weird things in the name of parenting trends. Hello, amber teething necklaces, weighted sleep sacks, those weird baby helmets for head shaping. But still, baby cages. It's hard to wrap your mind around it. There were stories of accidents, of course. A few cages fell, some babies were injured, there were concerns about exposure to extreme weather or birds or even kidnappers. But for the most part, they were considered safe. No major public scandal ever broke around them. No mass recall. They just faded out. By the 1940s, modern medicine had caught up. Vaccines became more widely available. TB rates dropped, and with that, the obsession with airing out babies disappeared. The baby cages were quietly removed from windows stashed in basements or tossed out entirely. It's like everyone collectively agreed to forget they ever existed. But those old photos still remain grainy, black and white snapshots of babies in their little cages, hanging out over the busy streets below, smiling, sleeping, breathing in that healing air. I look at those pictures now and I don't know whether to laugh or feel deeply unsettled. Probably both. Because here's the thing, when you zoom out, the baby cage wasn't really about babies. It was about parents, mostly mothers, trying to do everything right in a world that gave them so few options. It was about fear, about following medical advice that was sometimes helpful, sometimes deadly, and it was about trust. Trusting that the people selling you a product had your child's best interests at heart. But as we're learning in this series, that trust hasn't always been earned. From whiskey rags to morphine syrups, and now to cages dangling above concrete sidewalks, parents have always been vulnerable to promises of peace, safety, and silence. And companies. They've always known how to sell those promises. The baby cage is just one more reminder that good intentions don't always make good outcomes. And just because something was normal once, doesn't mean it was ever safe. Chapter 5. Diapers, Disposables, and the $1,000,000 Housewife. Okay, let's talk about diapers. Not exactly glamorous, I know. But if you've ever had to change 1 or 30, you know that diapers rule your life when there's a baby in the house. And today they're everywhere. We've got super absorbent, leak-proof, biodegradable, lavender-scented diapers that practically change themselves. But it wasn't always this convenient. In fact, the history of diapers is a messy one, literally and figuratively. Let's rewind to the early 20th century. Back then, diapers weren't something you bought, they were something you made. Parents, mostly mothers, would cut up old blankets, flour sacks, or even dishcloths to create makeshift nappies. They'd fasten them with safety pins, or if those weren't around, with strips of fabric. It was resourceful, but far from ideal. Cleanup was brutal. There were no diaper genies, no wet wipe warmers, just a bucket, some boiling water, and a whole lot of elbow grease. And to get the smell and stains out, harsh chemical cleaners. Bleach, borax. Stuff that could make an adult's skin burn, let alone a baby's. So diaper rash was more than just common, it was practically guaranteed. Babies were constantly irritated, raw red, and crying. And if you were poor or had multiple kids in diapers at once, it was a never-ending cycle of wash, dry, reuse, repeat. Honestly, it's kind of amazing anyone had more than one child back then. Now, I want to introduce you to someone I didn't learn about in school but should have, Marian Donovan. In the 1940s, Marian was living what many women of her time were expected to want. She had left her job as an editor at Vogue, gotten married, and settled into the role of a stay-at-home mom. But Marian wasn't the kind of woman who just accepted the mess of early motherhood. No. She was observing, questioning, and then she started inventing. She was sick of cloth diapers, sick of the leaks, sick of the stains, sick of scrubbing the same damn things day after day. So one day, she looked at her shower curtain, yes, her shower curtain, and had an idea. She cut it up. She sat down at her sewing machine and created a waterproof diaper cover that was soft, breathable, and didn't require sharp safety pins. She added little snaps to the sides, ingenious by the way, and made a pocket where you could slide in an absorbent pad. It was leak-proof, it was reusable, it was revolutionary. She called it the boater. Why, I don't know. Maybe because it floated either way it worked. Marian patented her design and confidently marched into the offices of major manufacturers, diaper in hand, ready to change the game. But guess what? They laughed her out. They told her no one would buy it. That moms were fine with the way things were. That diapering wasn't a problem that needed solving. Classic. So Marian did what any underestimated woman does, she made it happen herself. She started selling her boaters at Saks Fifth Avenue. And they sold out immediately. 2 years later, she sold her company for $1 million. Now, $1 million in the 1950s? That's huge. And for a woman, especially one working in a male-dominated industry, practically unheard of. But even then, the idea of disposable diapers still hadn't fully taken off. Marion's invention was reusable, less messy, yes, but it still required washing. The real explosion came in the 1960s thanks to a man named Victor Mills. Victor wasn't a mom, obviously. He was an engineer at Procter & Gamble, and he hated changing diapers. Legend has it he was changing his newborn grandson's cloth diaper and just thought, nope, there has to be a better way. And because he worked at a massive consumer products company, he had the resources to make it happen. Victor and his team created the first successful disposable diaper. They called it Pampers. At first, they weren't a hit. They were expensive, 5 times the cost of cloth diapers, and bulky. But over time, P&G improved the design. They added elastic legs, Velcro-like fasteners, and a super absorbent gel that could hold in everything. They even added cute little designs to make them more appealing. By the mid-1970s, Pampers had become a household name, and diapering would never be the same. But here's the twist, because there's always a twist. This massive innovation didn't come without consequences. Disposable diapers created convenience, yes, but they also created a mountain of waste, billions of diapers tossed into landfills every year. Some estimates say a single diaper can take up to 500 years to decompose. On top of that, many early disposable diapers contained harsh chemicals, dyes, and synthetic fragrances, things that weren't always safe for baby's skin. And parents, as usual, were trusting that these products were tested, regulated, and safe. But the truth? That wasn't always the case. We'll get into that more in the next chapter, but the bigger point here is this: just like with soothing syrups and baby cages, every solution comes with a cost. Marion Donovan changed the game for mothers everywhere. She gave them back their time. Victor Mills gave them even more convenience, but at a cost to the environment and sometimes their child's health. It's this constant dance between progress and pressure, between wanting what's best for our children and trusting that what we're sold is actually safe. And honestly, I don't blame parents. Parenting is hard enough without having to be a chemist, an environmentalist, and a detective just to choose a diaper. But that's where these stories matter. Because when you know where things came from, when you understand the history, you start asking better questions, you start noticing patterns. Like how every major advancement in baby care was created in response to stress. Stress from crying, stress from laundry, stress from just trying to survive. And companies. They've always been there ready to sell a solution, whether it's real or not. Chapter 6. The Drymax Scandal. When diapers started burning babies. By now, we've seen how the history of baby products is full of good intentions, bad decisions, and a lot of overlooked consequences. But what makes this next story hit harder is that it didn't happen 100 years ago. It wasn't some Victorian-era nightmare or wartime experiment. It happened in 2010. I was old enough to remember that year vividly. Facebook was booming. Smartphones were becoming a thing, and we thought we were living in a time when products had to be safe because, well, they had to be right. We had government oversight, consumer watchdogs, the internet. Nothing dangerous could just slip through the cracks anymore. Right. That's what made the Drymax scandal so shocking. Let's set the scene. Pampers, by this point, was the diaper king, practically synonymous with parenting. Trusted by hospitals, pediatricians, and exhausted new parents everywhere. They had the reputation, the reach, and the money. So when they announced their new Drymax diaper technology, people listened. The pitch was pretty simple: thinner, more absorbent, and more comfortable for babies. Basically, it was the iPhone of diapers. Sleeker, smarter, better. Except, it wasn't. Not long after the Drymax diapers hit the market, something weird started happening. Parents began noticing angry red rashes on their baby's skin, deep blistering welts that didn't look like the usual diaper rash. Some parents described open sores. Others said their babies would cry in pain when the diaper touched them, and no amount of cream powder or ointment helped. At first, people thought maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe their baby had sensitive skin. Maybe it was a heat rash. But the stories kept coming. One by one, parents across the country began posting photos online, bright red burns, peeling skin, and worst of all, babies in obvious pain. And that's when Facebook moms went full investigative journalist. Forums lit up, threads exploded, moms started comparing notes, posting batch numbers, timelines, and even sharing photos of the diapers themselves. And a terrifying pattern started to emerge. These burns were only happening with the new Drymax diapers. What's wild is how quickly the movement grew. Within weeks, thousands of complaints had been filed. A class action lawsuit was announced. The story was picked up by national news. Parents weren't just angry, they were devastated. They trusted Pampers. They assumed diapers, the one thing every baby uses dozens of times a week, had to be safe. And now their babies were screaming in pain. So what did Pampers do? They denied everything. According to Pampers and their parent company, Procter & Gamble, there was no evidence that their Drymax diapers were causing any harm. They released official statements insisting the diapers were safe. They said their internal testing showed no problems. They blamed social media hysteria, calling it a modern-day diaper witch hunt. They even suggested subtly that maybe the problem was the parents, that maybe people weren't changing the diapers often enough, or maybe they were using creams that caused irritation. Anything really to shift the blame away from the product. It felt like gaslighting on a massive scale. And look, I get it. No company wants to admit their flagship product might be hurting babies. That kind of scandal could tank a brand overnight. But still, the way they handled it felt cold, dismissive, like the pain of these parents and their babies was just bad PR to be cleaned up. To be fair, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission did investigate. They said they found no unusual hazard linked to the diapers. But they also admitted they couldn't explain the volume or severity of the complaints. It was one of those gray areas where official reports say one thing, but real-life experiences say something very different. And that's the part that sticks with me. Because when you're a parent and your baby is suffering, you don't care what the data says. You care that your child is in pain. And if dozens, hundreds of other parents are saying the exact same thing, you start to question everything. Every product, every label. Every brand you thought you could trust. Eventually, Procter & Gamble quietly pulled the Drymax design off the shelves. No recall. No public apology. Just gone. Replaced with a newer model, a softer design, a friendlier marketing campaign. And just like that, the conversation faded. But for the parents who lived through it, it didn't fade. You don't forget the sound of your baby crying in pain. You don't forget the helplessness of not knowing what's causing it. And you definitely don't forget being told it's all in your head. I think what gets to me the most about the Drymax scandal is how familiar it all feels. The cycle is the same. A product is released, people trust it, something goes wrong, the company denies it, and by the time any accountability might happen, the damage is already done. And maybe it's not always as dramatic as morphine in baby syrup or hanging a child outside in a cage, but it's still harm. It's still trauma. And it still comes from the same place, the belief that profit matters more than people, especially when those people can't speak for themselves. Babies can't say, "Hey, this hurts." They can't file a complaint. They can't write a bad review. So it's up to adults, parents, doctors, researchers to listen, to advocate, and to protect. But that only works if we're willing to believe them. And in 2010, a lot of people just didn't. What happened with Drymax is a reminder that we are never too advanced, too modern, or too regulated to fall back into the same mistakes. The only difference now is that instead of hiding the harm in silence, people have platforms. They have voices. And when those voices come together, companies do listen eventually. But it shouldn't take thousands of cries to be heard. Chapter 7. Bottles, Billions, and the Baby Industry Boom. You know what I've realized while digging into all of this? The baby industry is huge. I mean, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. Diapers, pacifiers, formula, cribs, monitors, wipes for the wipes. It never ends. And maybe that's not shocking. Babies are a full-time job, and keeping them safe, comfortable, and quiet, that's a premium business. But here's what really gets me somewhere along the way. Baby products stopped being about necessity and became more about aspiration. It's like you're not just buying a bottle. You're buying peace of mind. You're not just picking out a stroller, you're choosing a lifestyle. Everything is curated aesthetic and marketed with this unspoken promise. If you buy the right things, you'll be a better parent, a safer one, a more loving one. And that's the trap. Because parenting is already filled with self-doubt. Am I doing this right? Is my baby developing fast enough? Should I be worried about that weird noise they make when they sleep? And the industry knows that. They depend on it. They don't just sell products, they sell reassurance. And let's be real, this machine is well-oiled. Slick branding, soothing color palettes, photos of glowing moms, smiling dads, impossibly clean babies in crisp white nurseries. And then there's the celebrity endorsements. You probably remember when Jessica Alba launched The Honest Company. It started with a mission to provide non-toxic, eco-friendly baby products, diapers, wipes, cleaning sprays, and it sounded good, honorable even. People looked at her sideways at first, like, wait, you're an actress. What do you know about diapers? But she wasn't just selling wipes, she was selling trust. A celebrity mom saying, I've been there, I get it, you can trust me. And people did. The company blew up. At one point, it was valued at nearly $1 billion. And she wasn't the only one. Kristen Bell and Dax Shepard launched their baby line. Jennifer Garner jumped in with her organic baby food company, Once Upon a Farm. Cute branding pastel pouches and a farm-to-fridge concept that felt wholesome and homegrown. But you ever try to find that farm? I did. And let's just say, it's not exactly Little House on the Prairie. It's a brand. And behind the brand, investors' factories and a whole lot of money. I'm not saying these companies are evil. Some of them really do want to change the industry for the better. But we can't ignore that even the most natural baby brands are part of a system that profits off fear, specifically parents' fear of not being good enough. Because here's the unspoken message in every sleek commercial and Instagram ad: if you really loved your baby, you'd buy this. You'd upgrade. You'd choose the bottle that promises fewer gas bubbles, the diaper that costs twice as much because it's made from bamboo, or the organic puree that claims to boost brain development. And sure, maybe some of those products do work better, but a lot of it's just really good marketing. There's actually research behind this. According to one study, over 70% of new parents say they feel overwhelmed by the pressure to buy the right baby products. And almost half admit they've bought something out of guilt because they felt like not buying it would make them a bad parent. That breaks my heart. Because it's not just about money, it's about identity. About how we're taught to measure our love through our purchases. I've seen it happen in baby stores and online forums, in registry checklists that read like a wedding planner. And when I talk to parents, especially moms, I hear the same theme over and over again: I don't want to mess this up. And that fear, it's the perfect sales tool. So, yeah. The baby industry is thriving, but not necessarily because it's making life easier. Sometimes it's just making parenting feel more like a test you can fail if you don't spend enough. And let me tell you, after researching all these historical products from morphine syrups to cages dangling out windows, I've realized something we've always believed: the lie that the next thing will finally fix it. That there's a product that will finally help the baby sleep. That will stop the crying. That will make parenting feel less exhausting. But the truth is, no product can do that. At least not for long. The one thing babies have always needed through every era, every invention, every billion-dollar launch is love, attention, time. And yeah, sometimes that means they'll cry and you won't have the perfect solution. That doesn't make you a bad parent. It makes you human. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by the endless options, the shiny labels, the influencers saying, "This changed my life," just take a breath. You don't need all of it. You don't need most of it. What you do need: connection, support, and the reminder that being a good parent isn't something you buy. It's something you do over and over again imperfectly. And no brand can bottle that. Chapter 8. The Real Cost of Convenience. What history tells us about parenting today. So after everything we've talked about, from whiskey-soaked cloths to morphine-laced syrups, from baby cages swinging over busy sidewalks to modern diapers accused of burning skin, it's hard not to ask the big question: What have we actually learned? Because on the surface, it seems like we've made progress. We have better technology, stricter regulations, more information at our fingertips. But if you look just a little closer, the patterns are still there, just dressed in prettier packaging. That's the thing about history. It doesn't always repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And in this case, the rhyme sounds an awful lot like convenience over caution. Over and over again, parents have been sold the idea that the answer to exhaustion, fear, or frustration lies in a product, a syrup, a diaper, a gadget. And each time the product arrives with promises, this will help, this will fix it, this will finally let you sleep. But the part that never changes, the consequences when no one stops to ask. At what cost? And look, I get it. Parenting is exhausting. It's beautiful, yes, but also messy and relentless and full of doubt. So when something comes along and says, this will make it easier, you want to believe it. And why wouldn't you? You're already carrying the weight of doing everything right for someone who can't even say thank you yet. But as we've seen, some of the darkest chapters in baby product history didn't start with bad intentions. They started with desperation, with parents doing what everyone else was doing, with trusting what was on the shelf, with believing the ad because it said the product was soothing or gentle or recommended by experts. It's only in hindsight that we see the damage. That's why stories like this matter, not just because they're shocking or sad, but because they force us to pause, to ask better questions, to stop assuming that if something's for babies, it must be safe. Because sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just business. And that part hurts the most. Because when you look back at the families who lost their babies to soothing syrups or watched their children scream from a chemical burn or stood by while their trust in a product was turned against them, you realize something heavy. They weren't reckless. They weren't careless. They were doing their best. And honestly, that's what makes it so tragic. The baby industry today is worth over $350 billion. It runs on anxiety and algorithms, on influencers and product drops and monthly subscription boxes. It's not just about keeping babies alive anymore. It's about optimizing them, tracking their sleep, enhancing their development, curating their environment before they can even open their eyes. But here's what no algorithm can replicate: human connection. Love, patience, imperfection. All the messy, unpredictable stuff that no product can replace. So if you're a new parent, or even just someone thinking about becoming one someday, this is what I want you to take from all of this. You don't need every product. You don't need to follow every trend. You don't have to buy your way into being a good parent. Your child doesn't need a perfect home. They need you present, real, and trying your best. And if the baby cries, that doesn't mean you failed. It just means they're human, just like you. So as we close this story, maybe the real takeaway isn't about bottles or diapers or billion-dollar companies. Maybe it's about remembering that the most powerful thing you can give a baby can't be bought. Yeah, Chapter 9. Echoes of the Cradle. Why these stories still matter. You know, after spending weeks researching these stories, going through old ads, medical journals, lawsuits, photos, and hearing the voices of parents from different centuries, I kept asking myself, why does this still haunt me? We've already closed the book, right? The dangerous syrup is off the shelves. The baby cages are gone. The diapers that burned skin were pulled back quietly. So why can't I just leave this behind like a bad memory? I think it's because somewhere deep down I recognize that we haven't really moved on. We just changed the packaging. The truth is, what happened in the past isn't locked in history. It's woven into how we parent today. How we shop, how we scroll, how we judge ourselves. Every story we've explored, from Mrs. Winslow's syrup to the billion-dollar baby industry, is still echoing, still shaping how we think about safety, trust, and love. And maybe that's why this episode belongs on True Crime Echoes. Because these aren't just crimes of negligence or corporate greed, they're quiet crimes, cultural ones, the kind we don't even realize are happening until years later when someone finally says, wait, that wasn't okay. It makes me wonder how many things we're doing right now today that will horrify future generations. Will they look back at our reliance on screens and say, you gave your toddler a tablet before they could speak? Will they shake their heads at the idea of sleep training apps chemical-laced wipes, or Bluetooth-enabled bassinets. Or maybe they'll say nothing. Maybe they'll just repeat the cycle. Because that's the thing about parenting, it's always evolving, but it's always vulnerable. We're all just trying to keep a tiny, fragile human alive. And when someone offers a shortcut, it's hard to say no, especially when it's wrapped in promises. Especially when you're exhausted, scared, and alone. I don't have kids of my own, not yet, but this research gave me a glimpse into how heavy that responsibility really is. And how easy it is to lose your own voice in a sea of advice trends and product reviews. To forget that your instincts matter, that your presence matters, and that sometimes the simple way isn't the safest way. So I guess if I could leave you with anything, it's this: whether you're a parent, a future parent, or someone who just cares about how we treat the most vulnerable among us, never stop questioning what's considered normal. Because normal once included giving babies morphine. Normal once meant hanging infants outside windows in cages. And normal today still involves a whole lot of blind trust. But maybe we can rewrite what normal means together. Maybe normal can be slowing down, asking harder questions, refusing to measure love by the price tag, and remembering that behind every shiny product there's a company and a motive. This whole journey started with a simple observation that baby stuff has gotten wildly extra. But what it uncovered was a much deeper truth, that for over a century the people who market to parents have learned exactly how to exploit their love. And that love, raw, desperate, unconditional, is what makes parents so powerful and so easily targeted. But love can also be what breaks the cycle. So thank you for coming with me through this story, for listening, for caring, for being the kind of person who's willing to look at the past even when it's uncomfortable and say, we can do better, because we can, and we should. Chapter 10. The Price of Trust. When fear becomes a business model. There's one thing that's stuck with me through this entire journey. One thread that kept pulling itself through every product, every invention, every parent's decision. Fear. Fear is what sold the syrup. Fear is what justified hanging a baby outside in a cage. It's what turned a shower curtain into $1 million diaper. It's what filled shopping carts with things no one truly needed, but had to buy just in case. And maybe that's what scares me the most. Because when I started researching this story, I thought I was exploring a specific topic: baby products, a niche corner of history. But what I found was so much bigger than bottles and blankets and bassinets. What I found was a blueprint. A very old, very profitable one. Here's how it goes. Step 1, make people afraid. Step 2, offer them a solution. Step 3, profit. And the cycle just keeps spinning. You see it in the way we treat our health too. You hear a new study about some toxin or ingredient, and suddenly there's a product designed to protect you from it. A filter, a patch, a pill, something to buy. You see it in how we talk about safety, about aging, about beauty. There's always something to be fixed. And conveniently, there's always someone ready to sell you the fix. And what makes it work is the illusion of trust. The warm language, the comforting visuals. The idea that they have your best interests in mind, that this time it's different, that the world may be overwhelming, but don't worry, they've got you covered. But history tells a different story. History tells us that trust is easy to gain when people are afraid, that we're more likely to believe the lie when the lie sounds like hope, and that even the worst harm can be hidden beneath a soft color palette and a calming voice. It's uncomfortable to sit with that, especially when you realize that you've probably fallen for it too. I know I have. There's a part of me that wants to believe companies are trying their best, that marketing teams aren't just calculating which phrases trigger the most guilt, that no one would really risk children's safety for the sake of quarterly profits. But that part of me also knows better. Because every time I opened a historical newspaper, or read a court transcript, or listened to a parent testimony from decades ago, it was right there. People sounding the alarm, people being ignored, people losing everything while corporations protected their image. And here we are again, with better fonts and faster shipping. So what do? Just stop trusting everything, live in constant skepticism. No. I don't think that's the answer either. What I think we need is curiosity. Not paranoia, just awareness. A willingness to ask who benefits if I believe this, whose voice isn't being heard. What aren't they telling me? Because once you start asking those questions, the power shifts, just a little. But enough. I know this story was about baby products, but really it was about all of us. About how easily fear becomes currency, about how we confuse comfort with safety, about how silence doesn't always mean peace. And maybe most of all about how remembering the past isn't just about knowing, it's about noticing when history starts to repeat itself. So as we close this out for real this time, I just want to say this. Don't let fear sell you silence. Ask the hard questions, even if the answer costs someone money, even if the answer is, we've been here before. Chapter 11. Soft lies, hard truths, how we learn to ignore our instincts. Sometimes when I'm researching stories like this, stories that crawl under your skin and stay there, I have to take a step back. Not because I'm overwhelmed by the history or the facts, but because I start to see myself in the people I'm talking about. Not literally, of course. I've never given morphine to a baby, or hung a child outside my apartment window in a metal cage. But emotionally, I get it. I understand what it feels like to be unsure, to want someone to just tell you what to do, to hand you the right thing, the safe thing, the thing that makes you feel like you're not messing everything up. And that's the part that's hard to admit. Because for most of us, our instincts are still there quietly humming in the background. That little voice that says, this doesn't feel right. But we're taught early on to ignore that voice, to defer to someone more official, more polished, more professional. Someone with a shiny label or a lab coat. Someone who sells the solution. And what I've realized is this. The more powerless you feel, the more tempting it is to surrender your judgment, to go along with the crowd, to follow the ad, to believe the smiling spokesperson instead of the pit in your stomach. This isn't just a parenting issue. It's a human one. I think about all the times in history people have followed bad advice because it came in the right packaging. A product that felt safe because it was sold in pharmacies. A treatment that sounded modern because it had a scientific-sounding name. A new breakthrough that no one dared to question because, well, everyone else seemed to be okay with it until they weren't. And what's haunting is how often those stories don't end in evil. They end in silence, in slow, unnoticed harm, in people doing what they were told until it was too late. There's this idea we like to believe that if something were truly dangerous, someone would stop it. That there are checks and balances. That there's someone out there double-checking everything before it reaches us. But history tells a different story. It tells us that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it wears a smile. And maybe that's why these stories stay with me long after I finish writing, because they remind me how fragile our sense of security really is, how often we trade it for convenience, or comfort, or belonging. I think about the mothers in the 1800s who gave their babies soothing syrup, not because they didn't care, but because they cared so deeply they couldn't bear the crying. I think about the parents who bought Drymax diapers, who trusted the brand, who followed the instructions only to realize too late that something wasn't right. And then I wonder, how many moments have I ignored that same feeling in my own life, not with a baby, but with decisions that mattered? Jobs, relationships, choices that felt wrong, but came so neatly wrapped I didn't want to look too closely. That's the power of soft lies. They don't scream, they reassure, they don't fight you, they soothe you into silence. But the truth. The truth is rarely soft, it's sharp, inconvenient, uncomfortable. It makes you question what you thought was safe, what you thought was normal, what you wanted to believe. And yet, it's the truth that saves us. So maybe that's the real work. Learning to sit with the discomfort of truth. To notice when something feels off even if no one else sees it yet. To stay awake even when the world offers you a dozen ways to fall asleep. And maybe that sounds dramatic. But if history has taught me anything, it's that comfort can be a cage just as much as it can be a cradle. So, whatever season of life you're in, parent, student, caretaker, survivor, don't underestimate the power of your own awareness. Don't forget how many people in history suffered because they were told their instincts didn't matter. Yours do, they always have. And that small voice in your gut, the one you've been taught to ignore, maybe it's time to listen again. Chapter 12. When Someone Finally Speaks, the Power of One Voice. Sometimes I wonder how long these stories would have stayed buried if just one person hadn't spoken up. Like, what if no one questioned the syrup? What if no parent posted those photos of the dry max rashes? What if everyone kept thinking, it must just be me? I must be overreacting. History might have looked very different. Because the truth is, most of the time, real change doesn't start in a boardroom. It starts with someone unimportant. Someone with no power, no spotlight, just a gut feeling and a refusal to shut up. And that's the part I keep coming back to. All it takes is one voice. One parent who says, no, this isn't normal. One nurse who says, I've seen this before and I'm not ignoring it again. One worker who leaks the memo. One journalist who connects the dots. One survivor who tells the truth, even if their hands are shaking while they do it. That's where it starts. Not with confidence, but with discomfort. With someone standing in a room full of people nodding and choosing not to nod. And yeah, it's terrifying. Because speaking up feels like risk. Like you're breaking the rules, like you're making people uncomfortable. And sometimes you are. Sometimes people don't thank you. They roll their eyes. They call you dramatic, or difficult, or emotional. But you know what else they call you? Right. Eventually they call you right. The thing is, every system that profits off silence, off unchecked harm, depends on one thing: that you'll stay quiet, that you'll second-guess yourself, that you'll convince yourself it's not your place. But history shows us what happens when that silence breaks. When someone speaks, it gives other people permission to speak too. It starts small. A thread on a forum, a whispered conversation at a parent group, a shaky email to a local reporter, and then suddenly there's a ripple, then a wave, then a story no one can ignore. And I think that's where hope lives, not in the idea that the world will always be safe or that we'll always get it right, but in the fact that eventually someone always speaks. Even when they're scared, even when it costs them, even when no one believes them at first. And if you're listening to this right now and thinking of something you've noticed, something that doesn't sit right with you, something that maybe no one else is questioning, I want to tell you that voice in your head, it matters. Your perspective matters. You don't need to be an expert to speak the truth. You just need to be paying attention. Every story we've walked through in this series, every product, every policy, every painful silence could have lasted even longer if not for the people who refused to be quiet. And no, they didn't always get justice right away. Sometimes they were ridiculed, sometimes they were ignored, but sometimes their voices reached the right ears, and they sparked something bigger than they could have imagined. That's what keeps me going when this research gets dark, when the history feels too heavy, when it seems like no one's learning. I remember that change isn't always visible in the moment, but it starts the second someone speaks. So if you've been wondering whether to speak up, ask questions, push back, let this be your sign. Not just for you, but for the ones who can't speak yet. The babies, the patients, the vulnerable, the people whose pain hasn't been named yet. Because silence protects power. But your voice, it protects people. So after 12 chapters of whispered warnings, silenced parents, and softly packaged harm, where does that leave us? Hopefully, a little more awake. A little more willing to question the things we're told are safe, normal, or trusted. Because if there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's that real danger doesn't always come with flashing lights. Sometimes it comes with soothing music and a coupon code. We've seen how easy it is for silence to become a system, how fear is repackaged into products, and how people, especially the vulnerable, get left behind when profit comes first. But we've also seen the other side, the power of one voice, the ripple effect of someone asking, "Are we sure this is okay?" And that gives me hope. Not that we'll fix everything, not overnight, but that we'll stop sleepwalking through harm just because the label looks familiar. So if this story made you feel something, if it stirred a memory or a question, or even a quiet discomfort, don't ignore that. Follow it. Speak it. Share it. Because the next time someone says, "This is just the way it's always been," maybe you'll be the one who says, "Then maybe it's time we change it." Thanks for listening. I'm True Crime Echoes, and this has been True Crime Echoes.